What is the West and Westernizing, and the role of the West in history, past, present and future? There is a vacuum of thinking on these topics. See, for instance, the foolish documentary by the Harvard economist Niall Ferguson, Is the West History? 2011. Thesis: China, or Asia, is catching up to the West and is threatening to overtake it, beating it at its own game. What will the West's cleverness have availed it then? In this talk, we try to explain what the West is and how you can identify a Westerner. We discuss the role epic and irony play in, quotes, being Western. Specifically, we assert a connection between epic and the privileged spectatorship of art objects and art performance and being a Westerner. Our central focus will be Albrecht Altdorfer's Battle at the River Issus, 1529. Is it, as per Friedrich Schlegel's comment, a painting of the Iliad? This talk was first given on the 21st of June 2019 and is being given today on the 23rd of January 2020. Epic as world geographic evolutionary superrealism and the type of thinking it generates. Or, how you know you're a Westerner. Introduction. In this talk, we are interested in the biology of epic. So we are interested in the appearance of epics on the world scene as a purely natural phenomenon. There are 4 parts to the talk. The first is a short introductory survey to the theoretics of my earlier talks. The second part deals with Albrecht Altdorfer's Battle at the River Issus, which plunges us directly into an arrestingly vivid presentation of epic terrain. The third part deals with a specific connection between a 1529 painting and Western history, Western mythopoeic artifacts, and Western biology. The fourth part tackles our specific goal for this talk: where is the West, and how do you know you're a Westerner? Our assertion is that Westerners are the creators of and the privileged observers of epic objects. Westerners are standing on the shoulders of a whole series of ironic giants: artists, audiences, art critics, being enthralled by an outsider's bid for power and being amused by the ironies and comedy of its aftermath, which sets in train an ability to think both fuzzily and clearly about life in a, quotes, modern transitioning world. Part 1, the biology of epic. How history art works and how a single painting can connect us to the irony superhighway. Art is determined by population. Art is determined by population increase and the proximities that come with a density of population. So, when packed together, a species needs to signal its approvals and disapprovals so as to minimize friction. This applies for all complex life forms, although there is a point of differentiation between land and sea creatures. On land, you can have a settled domus for a species in which accurate signalling can take place, whereas in the sea, that is much harder to arrange. Put simply, on land it's easier to establish a theatre. So if a settled domus is available, the game of signalling can become much more formatted. In the last 5,000 years, humans have gone in for this in a very determined way, owing to a population increase of about 11 million to 7 billion, a 640-fold increase. The art is of special interest to the disadvantaged, NB the disadvantaged, because the powerful and the advantaged, let's say to begin with, don't really need to be accurate signallers. They just exert brute force. An agon begins between the advantaged and the disadvantaged in these circumstances. The advantaged, whose population increases faster than that of the disadvantaged, need to break out of their advantaged precincts to exploit the disadvantaged. So the disadvantaged themselves and also their less attractive but now indispensable remote terrains, and especially, of course, the resources found in them. The disadvantaged make more artistic complaining noise in the agon and even, counterintuitively, take a lead role in the prosecution of accurate signalling and the accurate thinking that goes along with it, or eventually goes along with it. All this might put us in mind of the dichotomy prey-predator, where the prey happily consume and thrive and expand, whereas the far less numerous predators have to resort to cunning, accurate observation, etc., to even make a dent in the numbers of the successful prey animals. So far, so simple. But now we move to the specifics of human art, and in particular the phenomenon epic, i.e. big works of art. The civilizations that have emerged in the last 5,000 years go in for, in an initial stage, monumental architecture. And along with this first phase go the monumental artworks, epics. The initiators of the monuments are not, however, the initial civilizers, but the theoretically second group that comes from outside to knock them over. So back in the 3rd millennium BC, you have the ambiguous, quotes, civilizer Gilgamesh, who becomes the central focus for the Gilgamesh epics. And in the 1st millennium BC, there are the roughly contemporary developments of 1, the Iliad-Odyssey cycle, and 2, the biblical texts, both traditions telling stories of the peripherally insignificant who take on civilization and win out spectacularly. But having had their spectacular success, the Greeks and the Israelites experienced something like the vertigo that Gilgamesh experienced 2 millennia earlier, after his successes. The vertigo seems to be a fixed fate for the successful predator. It's the problem of trying to survive in a world where there is now only successful predators. And so it is that now the ironizing accuracy of the outsider artistic predator peripherals has to be resorted to in ever-increasing measure. And the result of all this is a nightmarish, quotes, modern world of big noting advertisement, bluff, and tricky talk, only with difficulty being counterbalanced by sober science, itself a byproduct of the abstracting ironies, a probing of the weaknesses in existing understanding and in existing commonplaces. A further counterbalancing maneuver is the irony of humour. So that will have to suffice as an outline for the material culture of complex life forms and their signalling. Now we will try to show how this abstracting or ironizing process works, using a single painting from 1529, Altdorfer's The Battle at the River Issus. An intriguing detail about this work is that the high guru of Romanticism, the art movement of, according to me, distressed outsiders, Friedrich Schlegel, encountered this painting in Paris in 1803, after Napoleon Bonaparte had looted it from Bavaria in order to satisfy an obsession with all things Alexander the Great. And on seeing it, Schlegel observed, "It's a little painted Iliad." This anecdote will help us to draw a diagram relating to a history of the privileged observers of art. The diagram is this. Here's us in 2019 I think we can agree that we are privileged observers. Here's Friedrich Schlegel, a German who wanders into Paris in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars to go sightseeing. Assuredly consider him a lucky observer. 1529, a Bavarian elite. Bavaria is largely free of the extreme turbulence of Middle Europe in the 1520s, so lucky observers. The European and Middle Eastern audiences for the Alexander Romance are our next privileged observers. 333 BC, some literary and scientific types that Alexander took with him to the east to witness his major encounters with the Persians. Lucky observers. 8th century BC, Homer's mind's eye and the archaic Greek aristocracy's megaron households. Privileged observers. Then, the late Bronze Age, 1200 BC, some unthinkable first person believes it worthwhile and has the leisure to string together an account of aspects of the Sea People's invasions and give operatic performances of his account. So, here today, you are to imagine that we in this room are looking down a very privileged telescopic tunnel of dramatic presentation, or ironic presentation in my terminology, like so. All these moments in history can be said to correspond with population increases, but I don't want to talk about that side of things just now. What we are interested in today is whether, along with Schlegel, we should see this painting as a depiction of a moment in, or somehow the whole of, the Iliad. Part 2, Altdorfer's Battle at the River Issus. The painting was commissioned by Wilhelm IV of Bavaria and executed by Albrecht Altdorfer, an engraver, painter, architect, but also the mayor of Regensburg. Here's Bavaria, here's Germany, there's Bavaria, southeast here, Regensburg here. The painting is about as high as my shoulder and about this wide. It has been trimmed on all four sides, so we are, unfortunately, missing an entire perimeter based on what some curator or curators have deemed not absolutely necessary. It depicts Alexander the Great's victory over the Persians, led by Darius III in 333 BC at the River Issus, in the northeast corner of the Eastern Mediterranean in present-day Turkey. The painting attempts a certain amount of striking cartographic, figural and architectural realism, whilst also focusing on certain traditional concerns for both the depiction of Alexander and his struggle against the Persians, and also certain traditional formulae for the presenting of an epic object. Let's do a quick run-through of the cartographic, figural and architectural realism, whilst also commenting on the surrealism and superrealism of certain epicized features. The Eastern Mediterranean is the sea here. And this is an oversized and overly mountainous Cyprus. The viewer's vantage point is up so high as to be able to see in the distance a Red Sea off to the left, this light area over there. And here is the Nile with its traditional 7-branch delta. The little smudge here is bravely held by experts to be a Tower of Babel. The city back here to the right is thought to be Tarsus, and in 333 BC has two Christian church towers which are in a sort of halo. These two building complexes here, there and there, seem to be speaking about the two differentiating fates of the combatants. The western side, up higher, successful, still intact, whilst in the east, down lower, failing and falling apart. Up in the sky, a large amount is going on. In the east, a crescent moon is high up in the sky and seems to preside over a darkened world and to be functioning as a symbol for the Islamic realms. Over in the west, you could be forgiven for thinking that you were looking at a sun that is illogically rising and casting a new light on a Western world. In the centre, and very much foregrounded, is a flamboyant notice board flying supernaturally through the sky and trumpeting the triumph of Alexander over Darius. Its slight angle may be intended to accommodate the gaze of someone living in Bavaria back here. I will just read out to you a translation of what the original German said. The battle between Alexander the Great and the Persian king Darius III at Issus in the year 333 BC concludes the advances of the Persians. Alexander is victorious and Darius turns and flees. Turns and flees. Turning and fleeing there. The Latin, which replaced that which is still on the painting today, says, Alexander the Great defeating the last Darius after 100,000 infantry and more than 10,000 cavalrymen had been killed in the ranks of the Persians. Whilst King Darius was able to flee with no more than 1,000 horsemen, his mother, wife and children were taken prisoner. Now to the foreground. First, a little puzzle. Where, oh where, is the river Issus? Well, I mentioned to you that the painting has been trimmed on all sides. So in its original form, the Issus, actually the Pinarus, may have come down the left side here. Understanding that this is the Issus here in the distance going to the sea. And here up front is a river or creek with a half-immersed dead horse and more creek over here. Now to the action. The action is so stunningly coloured that it stands out from the natural world in a way that is suitable for an epic object. It screams at us that the conflict taking place is above and much more important than any real world. It's saying to us that this is the show worth paying attention to. It's thought that there is a blue-red division of sides. So Alexander's Greeks are in blue over here, and the Persians are in red over here. I think that this forces us to interpret that these here in the left foreground are Greek mercenaries. And yes, an historically correct detail, because the Persians did have Greek mercenaries, and at this battle. These red-clothed people right here, I can't find an explanation for. It may be a hinting that Alexander had some locals fighting for him, which is very likely. But it might even be a peculiar nod to the actual battle where people did in fact end up on each other's territory. And in fact, the battle did happen completely around the other way, with Alexander coming up from the southeast and the Persians being in the west. Some important details. Here, Alexander is on the offensive, charging the fleeing Darius. That's a lance up in front of him. He's charging. Note that the fleeing Darius has the only chariot, making him a little out of date in comparison with the Greeks on both sides, who are dressed up and equipped as modern knights. Another important detail, the presence of extravagantly dressed women and right up towards the fighting Here, there are the women, but very prominent. So that will do for basic identifications. Now, is it the Iliad? Well, a certain grandeur of scale, tick. Two warring sides ranged one against the other without too much complication, tick. A focus on selected protagonists, Alexander, Darius, the man in gold up here, him. These two guys up front, him and him. Maybe him in the distance, that one there. Maybe these two ladies with the ridiculous hats. More specifically for the Iliad, Alexander might be a sort of Achilles. This gold man could be the Nastes of Book 2, who went into battle wearing gold. Or the Glaucon who foolishly exchanged gold for bronze in Book 6. So several ticks. And whilst there are no gods, there is our flying notice board, giving a sort of authoritative celestial perspective on what is taking place. So half a tick. And also a sort of cloudy celestial chorus to the billowing events below. Another half tick. But that is as far as I'm prepared to go with the idea that this is an Iliad. And I would like to introduce at this point a very big problem for the interpretation of this painting as an Iliad. For a start, and with apologies to Schlegel and his art critical acumen, contemporaries would not have seen this as the Iliad. What would they have seen? Well, a possible objection to the Iliad idea comes with something sitting just about right in the middle of the painting. This rough, rocky eminence. What is it? And what is it doing there? There is no geophysical warrant for it, nor is there a narratological warrant for it from Antique's accounts of the battle. It seems to be Altdorfer's own invention, but based on what? I'm going to make a conjecture that it is Ha Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo of Revelation 16:16, the mountain that is going to dominate the terrain when the armies of the last days come to engage in their final apocalyptic battle. And that, as a consequence, what we are looking at here is a millenarian fantasia. There are some aspects of the painting which could support this view. If this is the Tower of Babel over here, we are in a sort of theological terrain. I'll just mention here that in medieval maps of the world, it was routine to have biblical topology depicted. Gardens of Eden, Golgothas, a prominent or central Jerusalem, and so on. See the Hereford Mappamundi of 1300. That it's about religion is also suggested by the two Christian towers. Moreover, the blatant anachronism of the medieval Christian knights is importing into the battle ideas about the Christian ideal. And if you're heading down to the Eastern Mediterranean, that means setting up the New Jerusalem. And another important matter, the Latin numbers. They are monstrously large and give calculations in raw thousands, so completely suitable for millenarian interpretation. 100,000 infantry killed, 10,000 cavalry killed, and Darius escapes with no more than 1,000 horsemen. So there, so far, is a bit of a case that this is the Battle of Issus imagined as a sort of millenarian event. However, we can go much further. Somebody agrees with me that this is Issus as Armageddon, and it is either the author or publisher of this rather well-known book, Norman Cohn's The Pursuit of the Millennium, 1957. The cover of which shows the right side of our painting and in a way that sneakily brings the two church towers right into the central point of the front cover. This is an intriguing and, for a number of reasons, landmark book. One of the reasons for its landmark status is that previous to this, you wrote histories of peoples, of civilizations, of clashes of peoples, of clashes of civilizations, and occasionally works on political or economic science. This book, riding on a tide of the 20th century interest in sociology, is a long, serious history of a state of mind. It tells the story of millenarian groups in the period 1000 to 1600 AD and pays close attention to the period toward the end of this era, where you have a highlight for millenarian thinking. The German Peasants' War of 1524, 1525, only a few years before our painting, and its rather famous afterglow, the Anabaptist seizure of the city of Munster in 1535-36, and the activity of the latter-day Messiah, John Bockelson of Leiden. This is an exquisite engraving of him done in 1536, and I'm reading from the image in this book. The orb with the two swords symbolizes Bockelson's claim to universal dominion, both spiritual and secular. Gottes Macht ist mein Kraft. God's power is my strength was one of Bockelson's mottos. Understanding the historical background to our painting and Altdorfer's world is essential for understanding the way in which it functions as a counterblast to the political and social upheavals of this period. It's attempting to be more millenarian than the millenarians. The most significant event in the 1520s is the German Peasants' War. It is by far the biggest armed popular revolt in European history until the French Revolution comes along. Some 100 to 300,000 people die. Most of these are poorly equipped peasants. The designation German is unfortunate. The battles that take place are throughout central and southwestern Germany, all the way through to Switzerland, down here. So up here, down the west here, down into Switzerland, then around into Austria. Notice that in this mapping of the series of armed revolts, Altdorfer's Regensburg seems to luckily miss out on being involved. And Altdorfer's patron, Duke Wilhelm IV of Bavaria, so the ruler of southeastern Germany, is one of the principals in the fighting to put down the revolts. This series of loosely connected revolts is born of poverty and disgust with authority, both secular and spiritual, and is fueled significantly by a growing acquaintance with the vernacular translations of the Bible, in which religion is promising a humanity equality and a freedom from tyranny, together with a final period of world warfare that will precede the arrival of the Messiah riding in on the clouds of heaven. To just paint a picture of a world experiencing the end of history as we have known it, here are some helpful dates of events, artworks and personalities 1400 to 1600. Skip over the first two Sir Johns, and 1453, the fall of Constantinople, a lot of ancient texts go west. 1455, Gutenberg's Bible, the general public becomes acquainted with a Bible that talks of equality and apocalyptic promise. 1467, Nicholas Germanus, monk and cartographer, makes a map of the world which not only shows a rounding surface, but also rational spaces for the sea between continents. 1492, Columbus. 1493, Hartmann Schädel's Nuremberg Chronicle, a biblically based account of history with pictures and significantly also realistic-ish depictions of modern world cities. So people are getting to see the world as it really appears. 1512, Machiavelli's The Prince. The perfect Christian prince can't be a perfect Christian prince. He needs to be pragmatic and needs to occasionally play dirty. This is not exactly news to the world, but writing it down is. 1522-23, the Knights' War is a sort of last hurrah for the medieval period. 1524-25, the German Peasants' War. The peasants and their supporters are anti-poverty, anti-serfdom, and profess a real belief in the apocalyptic promise of the Bible. 1526, the Battle of Mohacs. A real watershed moment in European history. The French King Francis has made a formal alliance with the Turks. And after Suleiman the Magnificent's victory over the Hungarians, the French and Venetian ambassadors are waiting at Buda to meet and congratulate him. 1527, the sack of Rome by an unpaid and out-of-control imperial army. 1529, Altdorf's battle at Issus. 1535-36, John Bockelson's Munster Revolt. 1536-41, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, which has far-reaching consequences for the history of England, religious, political, social and economic. 1543, Copernicus's publication of De Revolutionibus. 1570, the Pope declares Queen Elizabeth a heretic. And 1597, Henry IV, Part 1 by Shakespeare and the character Falstaff. Shakespeare had originally called Falstaff by the very suggestive name Oldcastle. The real Sir John Oldcastle was an actual friend of Prince Henry, the son of Henry IV. This real Oldcastle was a competent soldier and a fervent Lollard. So from an extreme Protestant group, widespread in England, which demanded, amongst other things, vernacular Bibles and intelligible religious instruction. Prince Henry intervened in 1413 to get Oldcastle off a heresy charge, but couldn't save him when he is accused of a conspiracy to abduct a royal personage, namely himself, now Henry V. The Oldcastle family, now in Shakespeare's time, prominent at court, objected to this name for the Falstaff character, and Shakespeare then based the career of the fictive Falstaff on that of another real person, not coincidentally another Lollard sympathiser, Sir John Fastolf. He is another competent soldier, but someone who is accused of running away from a battlefield in France, something he probably did, but only after the battle was lost. So notice, over a 200-year period, 1400 to 1600, these serious revolutionaries and competent, prominent figures are now being portrayed on the English stage in an ironic burlesque as a degenerate coward and enemy of the state. In other words, the medieval period has passed away so quickly that by the time of Shakespeare, the people who were creating a modern and significantly Protestant West were mere objects of levity. So to sum up, in Altdorf's era, somewhat broadly conceived, there is a frenzy of revolutionary thinking and biblical millenarianism. And it is to the Bible that we must now turn our attention. Part 3, a 1529 painting's connection to deep history, archaic artefacts, and, quotes, Western biology. In the light of our Part 2, I'm going to expand our first telescoping tunnel of privileged spectatorship with a second adjacent tunnel. What I'm hoping for here is that this new catamaran of privileged spectatorship will provide us with a sort of substantial ironic investment portfolio, and also that it will give us a clue to how epicizing began. Well, in a general sense, it all began with predator animals and their privileged position in the survival game. But we're dealing here with the local problem of the last 5,000 years. Where does epic come in? Answer: with geophysical historical anomaly. It's the anomaly of not just being peripheral to major civilizations, but being peripheral whilst at the same time being inaccessible or difficult of access. In an earlier talk, I explained how this works for the Greeks, who are one major route for our privileged ironizing. To briefly recap, here are the major civilizations: Sumer, Akkad, later Babylon, Assyria, Hittites up here, Egypt down here. And by geographical circumstance, these civilizations don't really have access to mainland Greece over here. So Egypt, in its long period of high civilization, is never in a position to run an army all the way up here. You go through there, go across here, go all the way over there, down here, to interact in the usual way that civilizations deal with their periphery. These Mesopotamian civilizations are likewise unable to do that. These Mesopotamian civilizations here, they have to get across the Taurus Mountains and then across the Aegean. This is too difficult. When the Persians finally attempt it in the 5th century BC, the whole enterprise results tellingly in abject failure. As a result of the geophysical anomaly, when Greece in the fullness of time becomes a civilization of a sort, it has to face up to the problem of having only outsider peripherals in its population. And so, too much aggression. And this generates the ironic spectacle of the hero aggressors of art suffering ironic downfalls in tragedy. And then after that, like Odysseus, just becoming participants in ironic games, defeating giants with puns, pretending to be other people, lying, and so on. And finally come the mega ironies of the laugh-out-loud comedies of Aristophanes and many others. That's one side of Western tradition. But what about Israel and the Bible? Well, it's substantially the same thing, and in more or less the same time frame. This Palestine area never really becomes a sharp focus for the major civilizations. It's surrounded by a lot of desert, and it has quite a lot of ravine-filled hill country, and it is not well served with water. Just to expand on this, there is a vast desert out here, which keeps you nicely away from the southern Mesopotamian powers. The Negev to the south is also very dry, keeping the Egyptians and Arabs at a bit of a remove. And the people who are traveling through this area from and to the north and south, mainly for trade, but sometimes for war or intimidation, prefer to stick to the easily traversable flat coast. So here they go right up on this, following this purple road. So this area in the middle, the higher country, doesn't have any difficulty in becoming, like mainland Greece, in my terminology, an outcrop of periphery, and for hundreds of years. Now, with that analysis in mind, let's move to the origins of the epic that appears in the Bible and our little special problem, the mountain of Megiddo. A little bit of geophysical background. 2 million years ago, a finger of sea is thought to go through what is now the Jezreel Valley. This finger of sea was connected to this area over here, which was also sea. This whole now still depressed area, shown here in blue, blue is below sea level, is a continuation of the East African Rift Valley and continues all the way up to the Bekaa Valley, keeps on going even further up, all the way up to the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. The Dead Sea here is still today about 1,400 feet below sea level, the lowest lake on Earth. And the Sea of Galilee up here is about 700 feet below sea level and is the second lowest lake on Earth. The rift area and its adjoining finger have risen over time and to the point where the rift has become completely cut off from the Mediterranean. This finger has become a long, wide valley. Here's the finger, it goes all the way through there. One big valley, where valley is an unfortunate term. It is in fact a long, flat plain. So for thousands of years, perfect for crops. In that regard, bear in mind that it has a river running right through the west side of it, not far from Megiddo. Here's Megiddo, and here is the River Kishon running through the left side. Now, history. When does this area become, quotes, historical? Answer, the Canaanite military campaign of Thutmose III of Egypt in the 15th century BC. Thutmose is the most successful expander of Egyptian territory and influence in the whole history of ancient Egypt. Backing his judgment that he will win brilliantly, Thutmose fatefully brings along a journalist on the campaign. This journalist writes up the ripping yarn of how the Pharaoh fooled the Canaanites waiting for him in the valley of Jezreel and expecting him to come through here, probably up through, very hard to see here, through here in any case. There were two ways into it. The other way, still, there's people still don't know where the other way is, but it's thought to be about here. But he was expected to come through on either side of Megiddo. He instead goes through a dangerous narrow passage to come out directly behind Megiddo. So he went straight through here and arrived straight at Megiddo. He then defeats the Canaanite coalition. The survivors run into the city of Megiddo itself. Then there is a 7-month siege and capitulation. The next historical moment is another pharaonic incursion described in the Meanpatarch stele of 1208, the so-called Israel stele. On the monument, the claim is made that the pharaoh laid waste the nomadic or semi-nomadic group Israel, and that, quotes, his seed is no more. It's not critical for my argument today, but my view is that Jezreel and Israel are the same word. Both, for instance, can be transliterated into English as this. So that what Meanpatarch was claiming was that he had defeated a group in the Jezreel Valley and then destroyed their famous crops. In the ancient world, destroying a food source is a well-known tactic used against tribal troublemakers. Losing their crops slows them down for a few years. Finally, for this period, up to 900 BC, we have Pharaoh Shishak, or Sheshonk, 945 to 925, who claims to have been very busy in Palestine, defeating 150 towns, none of which are Jerusalem, but many of which are in the Jordan and Jezreel valleys. So here he's having victories everywhere throughout here, but all through here and up here as well. And sadly, for biblical literalists, he has no encounter with a dual monarchy of Israel-Judah. Now we come to the Bible's version of history and our concerns with epic. A few quick prefatory remarks. A Bible is not history. It's a person's attempt to explain origins to a community. This activity comes to an end when there starts to appear academic objections to the account and no more authoritative literary attempts at the origin story can be made. Off here in 2019 and in a university, all that remains to do is explain how the Bible writers made their explanations, and in particular, to make a stab at the critical moment of when the biblical enterprise began. I'm going to suggest to you that the very first point for biblical writing is Hosea 2:21 to 2:23. And in that day, says the Lord, I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth, and the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. And I will sow him for myself in the land, and I will have pity on not pitied, and I will say to not my people, you are my people, and he shall say, thou art my God. So in the beginning, it wasn't that God created the heavens and the earth, but rather, in the beginning, there was a dialogue between heaven and earth. It's the first moment of irony, the first moment of religious drama. Heaven is the natural powers, sublime, violent, capricious, interventionist, and also beneficent. The earth is a place of dirt, clay, and also is a place of endless contingencies based on trying to cope with the cursing, trials, and sweet blessings of heaven. A human finds themselves suffering and benefiting from the vicissitudes set up by the curses and blessings that take place in the dialogue. And all that makes for a ready audience. The dialogue is sensibly couched in the terms of the two participants being male and female. So that allows the audience to make some basic identification with the ironic spectacle. Specifically, heaven is a cantankerous male, jealous of his power and impressed by his beneficence. And earth is a female caught in the well-known bind of wanting to be good and yet wanting some limitations on heaven's arbitrary dictates regarding extermination and exclusivity. The important point to note here for what is to follow is that an intervention made by the male god for his fickle female objects of care is, in coded biblical speak, a day of the Lord. So now to the content of the Bible. The central story, the epic of the Bible, is that of an invasion. What you are told is that a group of migrants who have vaguely previously lived in it invade a promised land. They do this by crossing the Jordan River from east to west, just above the north end of the Dead Sea. So just here. The people who invade are called Israelites, or just the collective identity Israel. The place being invaded is called Canaan, although confusingly is also called the land of the Amorites. Two problems of basic logic. On invading, the previous incumbents don't seem to recognize their previous abode. Nor does anyone ever say, gee, it's great to be back in X. The second problem is more glaring. Why is it that these so-called Israelites are not invading the historical Israel, which is way up to the north? Up here. They're invading here, and here's the historical Israel, which is way up to the north of where the invasion is taking place. Gilgal, the valley of Achor, and Jericho, all down here. Moreover, all the events described in the first 10 chapters of Joshua take place in the south. Well, this is because we are dealing with a theological and literary setup where the power that supersedes, here Judah, demands to be given priority over the actual first historical power, here Israel. So epic is beginning with a big blustering lie of a group of latter-day importance claiming to be superior to the group that it superseded. This gives rise to a fixed pattern in epic whereby the big blustering lie gives way to the rationalizing of the lie and then to an ironizing of the glorious story of superiority. And where most importantly, the rationalizing and ironizing is done with actual old material. Let's see this in action. In chapters 1 to 10 of Joshua, the Israelites invade Canaan, or the land of the Amorites, and have a great exterminating success. The cities are attacked, cursed and burnt, and everyone is then killed, even women and children, and sometimes their animals. This leaves the historian with a puzzle. Why would poor tent-dwelling invaders be killing women and animals, which would normally be booty? The explanation is, of course, that the text is theological and that women, specifically foreign women, are one of the root causes of Israelite impurity. And the enemy's animals are associated with non-kosher eating habits. But what I particularly want to draw to your attention is what the text says about the level of success of this rampaging extermination at the end of chapter 10, 1040 to 1043. So Joshua defeated the whole land, the hill country and the Negeb and the lowland and the slopes, and their kings he left none remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as the Lord God of Israel commanded. And Joshua defeated them from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza, and all the country of Goshen, as far as Gibeon. And Joshua took all these kings and their land at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to the camp at Gilgal. This is a very strange definition of the whole land. Kadesh Barnea in the southern wilderness, down here somewhere, to Gaza, 60 miles, and Goshen, which is almost Egypt, to Gibeon, which is just above Jerusalem, in Benjamin. So the big claim here for the invasion is that Israel has invaded the very southernmost parts of Palestine. And note what a strange invasion it is when the victor just goes back to his tent at Gilgal after the huge successes. Apparently, given the exterminating and burning, there is no real interest in actually living in the promised land, and not at this stage in its cities. But notice one other detail of this invasion. It is capped off with the Israelites defeating and capturing 5 kings of the Amorites in a battle where God has made a direct intervention. He has intervened to make the day longer by stopping the sun, and he has rained down hailstones on the retreating Amorites. It is worth noting that this is the first apocalyptic intervention of God with the resources of heaven, with the lengthened day and with the hailstones. And it is the first appearance of the theologically charged term, the day of the Lord. Joshua 10, 12 to 14. So, after the first 10 chapters of Joshua quotes, the whole land has been defeated. Then a sort of part 2 occurs for the invasion. The whole scene moves way up north, and chapter 11 opens with a war against King Jabin of Hatzor. Hatzor is way up here. This far, I think. this far. So all the stories were down here, and then bam, suddenly we're up here. And the text starts to reveal, logically or illogically, delete whichever doesn't apply, that even after all Joshua's conquests and with his retirement looming, quotes, there remains yet very much land to be possessed. The war against Jabin reveals some telling details of this second phase. The opponents are not Amorites, but Canaanites and many others. Not tent and hill people, but a better class of opponent that have most notably chariots. Also, we are talking about different populations. Note 11:4. And they came out with all their troops, a great host, in number like the sand that is upon the shore. So huge numbers now. But the most telling detail is that the great victory is hedged around by a whopper qualification. 11:10 to 11:13. And Joshua turned back at that time and took Hatzor and smote its king with the sword. For Hatzor was formerly the head of all those kingdoms. And they put to the sword all who were in it, utterly destroying them. There was none left that breathed, and he burned Hatzor with fire. And all the cities of those kings and all their kings, Joshua took and smote them with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. But none of the cities that stood in mounds did Israel burn. Stood on mounds? What the text is referring to is that all the cities in the valley of Jezreel, here, Tanakh, Megiddo, Jezreel itself, Jokneam, plus probably all the coastal cities are built on tells, i.e. on the accumulated detritus of previous stone habitations, which has raised up the level of the site, and in some cases over thousands of years. This establishes a pattern which will continue right throughout the text of Joshua and into the book of Judges. Israel, or one of the tribes, win a battle and then can't defeat the low-lying city or cities. The problem starts with the Jebusites in Jerusalem, 1563, occurs again at Gezer, 1610, but then spreads to the Jordan and Jezreel valleys, 1712. Later, this whopper qualification is expanded in a significant way. Not only can they not defeat the Canaanite cities, they can't even defeat the villages of those cities, the villages that surround those cities. First at 1547, then in Judges 1:27. And then a last point in the cycle, the degree zero and ultimate ironies for the invasion. First, the Israelite tribe, the Danites, are told they are not allowed to come down into the plain, so into the plain of Megiddo, Judges 1:34. And second, Israel is to be sold into slavery to a king of Mesopotamia, Judges 3:8, and to the king of Moab, Judges 3:14. And now the whole ugly truth about early Israel comes out. There is an actual historical struggle between a peasant or proletarian group and the advanced civilization of Canaan. This state of affairs is even expressed in the name of the disadvantaged group, Israel, that group that struggles against the head Canaanite god El. At some point in history, Jezreel has been exapted to Israel. Later than this, you have the intriguing older material of, for instance, the Song of Deborah near the beginning of Judges, where in one little block of very old texts, you can tell it's old because it has song, curse, blessing, you have all the elements of the biblical project. The Israelites descend from Mount Tabor at the end of the Jezreel Valley. They descend into the valley. So the valley has sort of two parts to it. There's a lower part and an upper part, and Mount Tabor is at the top branch, and makes war on the king of Hatzor's commander, Sisera, who has 900 chariots at his disposal. And all this takes place at the waters of Megiddo. A woman, theologically transported north from the deep south of Palestine, kills the tormentor of Israel, who is on the run from the battlefield. She does this by plunging a symbolic tent peg into his temple whilst he sleeps. The tent peg is mightier than the chariot. Irony. Her name, very significantly, is Ja'el. So she puts Yahweh, the primitive mountain god, ahead of the Canaanite god El. And here she is in a 17th century painting where, taking quite a few liberties with the text, she is flying through the air in an apocalyptic depiction with the hammer in her right hand and the tent peg in her left hand. So in summary, in the invasion, you start off late with grandiose claims to power, and you end up earlier with traditional material about the actual struggle that took place between Israelite tribes and first their tribal enemies, the Amorites, and then secondly, their sophisticated enemies, the Canaanites. The overall trajectory of the text is from bluffing claims about complete victory to rationalizing accounts of half successes, and then, much closer to the truth, to the true irony of the great invaders who, far from being conquerors, are oppressed hill people being sold into slavery. Part 4, how to identify a Westerner. Being a Westerner, it has nothing fundamentally to do with being white. And I'm going to come back to that point. And it has nothing fundamentally to do with being European. Nothing fundamentally to do with being of a particular race, and nothing fundamentally to do with being to the west of something. Our answer today is that Westerners are the privileged inheritors of generations of ironic spectatorship. On this planet, there have been 2 hotspots for being sheltered from the uncomplicated authoritarianism of high civilizations: mainland Greece and Palestine. The inhabitants of these privileged outsider terrains indulge themselves with overblown claims to world importance. As, however, their own place in high civilization emerges, their bluster takes on a turn in first a rationalizing direction, and then second in an ironic one. Ironic here in the more popular sense of anomalous, emptied out forms. The use of these forms is sometimes called wit. But just backtracking to the whiteness idea, if you were to rerun history with different land masses, you would still have civilizations emerging initially in the hot, wet, flat areas of the tropics, as happened in our history with Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Central America. So the peripheral outsider terrain might well be away from where the suntans are, and hence the possibility or even a probability of a lightness of skin. Conclusion. Epic is a fantasia based on a plan to take over or dominate the world. The fantasia is devised by a group favoured with a geophysical inaccessibility. In a period of an expanding network of civilizations, the geophysically favoured group, whilst not in any real sense in power, starts to trumpet their outsiders' plot to dominate. When power does finally come their way, the now established fantasia needs to move in a more rational direction. Later than this, the group graduates to having a high population, and there is a need to employ a more ironic approach to tradition. The ironic approach makes for keeping social friction to a minimum. Packaged up with this, people need to see the cultural hero playing it smart. and the group need to imitate that, or at the very least, take note of it and admire it. Our chosen focal point for the artistic grandiosity of Epic was a Renaissance painting by a privileged Bavarian who was able to draw on the ironic traditions of Greece and Judea in order to paint a picture of the dream of success. It's a dream of success that transports the, quotes, Western viewer onto an ironic superhighway to back at least as far as Thutmose III of Egypt, who thought, perhaps on a whim, to bring a journalist with him on a military campaign to Canaan. This artistic dream of success launches the exercising of a critical faculty in privileged generations alive and still to come. Thanks.